Tuesday morning, up and at 'em. I should start this with a bad trumpet solo, okay, playing Reveille or something like that, but I'm not going to. Instead, I want us to wake up to the reality of the joy of discipleship. And, as you read this little letter of Philippians that we looked at on Sunday, there's some characters that are listed in that little book. We find Timothy, who was developing as a disciple. And Paul was developing him as they went from place to place and shaping him for ministry. We also see a reference to Epaphroditus, who was sent to minister to Paul. And Paul was developing Epaphroditus in that. We in the book of Philemon, we saw a reference to Onesimus. And we know that Onesimus was probably discipled by the Apostle Paul. And we said he may have been one of the early church bishops or the overseer of the church at Ephesus. But there's a fourth person that I want us to focus on who I think maybe was also being discipled by the Apostle Paul, possibly even by the Apostle Peter. And we find a reference to that in Ephesians. No, in Philippians, because that's what we're studying. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, there's a division between two women in the church. And when Paul asks the church to help with this division, he refers in just passing to someone by the name of Clement. And he says he's a part of the fellowship he's a fellow worker in Christ. Now it indicates that Clement may have been a part of, say, the missionary team that ministered in differing areas. Now, if that's the case, it's interesting that we find a reference to a Clement who was born in Rome, had probably done ministry for several years, and for a period of about 10 years at the end of the first century, Clement became the overseer of the church at Rome and wrote several letters, or at least one significant letter. And we find then that Clement was one that may have been developing and growing even here at this point in Philippians. We can't prove that that's the same Clement, but it's interesting to think about, if it is. That means that part of the task of the early church was to develop young men, to get them ready for ministry, and that those young men were to have a joy for serving Christ. And I think Paul was leveraging the joy that he saw in these young men, and he was bringing them an opportunity to minister in the name of Christ and develop and grow. It's also interesting that one of the early church theologians and church fathers, Irenaeus, makes mention in one of his writings of a Clement who he says, Clement of Rome, that he says was a contemporary of the apostles. Now that puts that right back in the time of the writing of this letter. Now that means Onesimus, much like Clement, may have been a young man of about 20, ministering in a similar way as Onesimus later ministered, but he developed, and about 50 years later, he became a bishop in the church at Rome. Well, something to think about. We can't claim it's all fact, but it's interesting to just kind of put on a detective hat, play a little Sherlock Holmes a bit, and say, what if, what if, what if? And I hope that joy of discipleship will be yours, because I want you to discover the joy of discipleship in your life as well. Have a good one. Have a great Tuesday, and make it the whole day, okay? Bye for now. God bless.